examine how exactly information is stored in the modern world. When you key in personal information such as credit card details, your passwords in like apps that protect or keep a collection of your passwords, or any other kinds of information about yourself, such as your preferences and your kind of things that you look out for on the internet. When you think you just key it into your handphone, it doesn't just exist there. The information basically is stored in the cloud, and what this means is that it's a storage of information that is physically located elsewhere, perhaps in a center in the United States of America, but that you can easily access from at any point as long as you have a mobile device. Now, what's the problem with this is that recent events have shown that this do not be foolproof. For example, the recent scandal about the leak of nude photos of celebrities shows that this is not entirely hack-proof, that even the geniuses in Apple cannot come up with firewalls that can deter people from hacking the information that exists. Secondly, when you store information in the cloud, it doesn't deny the opportunity or the reality that operators would have to handle the information. We understand that millions of terabytes of information passes through the cloud, but at certain points or another, that information will be accessed by individual operators who would have to man these information points. Third, we think and we've seen how companies at several points have sold information that they have or they have access to because they've monetized this for the greater good. That's why certain tech companies cost billions of dollars. It's not because the product that they've created itself is worth billions of dollars, but the kind of information that they have access to is worth billions of dollars. So what's our policy? And we have to be very careful here. We're going to prohibit the storage of all this personal information from your mobile apps. Things like, for example, credit card information, things like your passwords, and your personal choices or of things that you look out for, they're all like no-go areas. We understand that certain apps require information so that you can streamline your experience and allow you to do things like book taxis. We think whilst you might take another minute to key in your credit card details before you can book that taxi, we think it's something that we're very willing to do on our side of the house. Now, we understand there's this little tricky part we've got to draw. How about pictures then? Because when you post pictures on Facebook, there is ostensibly a bit of information, personal information that is there. Now, this stands in contradistinction to the other types of information that we've talked about because of the nature of things like pictures that is meant largely for public consumption. That said, we stand for the side that at the point where you think that the information should no longer be for public consumption, that you can and should be able to withdraw the information for the public sphere and that no one should be able to have access to it ever. So we think there's certain bits of information that's completely no-go. There's some information that you can display, but at the point where you refuse to have that to be continually displayed, you can pull it back. I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the reappropriation of privacy in the online sphere and why we are able to do that with our policy. Secondly, we'll talk about how individuals lose control over information that is deeply important to them as individuals and why we need to act to stem that bleeding. And thirdly, we'll talk about how information is easily and readily given up for governmental surveillance and why our policy best addresses this problem. So first, about the reappropriation of privacy. We think privacy is important. Just like how as individuals in the physical sphere, we keep certain information to ourselves because we think information defines us as individuals, our experiences and the way we think of certain things shape the way we view the world, are important things that we might not want to share with anybody else. Similarly, we think your online existence, something that most people deal with on an everyday basis, private information that exists on the online sphere ought to similarly be kept private when you think it ought not to be shared. However, this kind of information is increasingly being shared and is increasingly lost to people because of the way it operates. Like I've mentioned earlier, when it's kept in the cloud, there are things like, for example, the possibility of it being hacked or people having access to the information that defines you as an individual, which could potentially be intrusive. You find that information or you think that information to be private when in reality it is not. We think that is an affront to the way individuals ought to view themselves and something that we're not willing to go for. But more importantly and more perniciously, we think the possibility of monetizing that information is the biggest affront towards individuals because it marks the greatest loss of privacy for the individual, because things that you want to keep private is currently being monetized for the profit and gain of another individual who ought not to have any proprietary interest or control over that bit of information. What we want to do with our policy is that when you prohibit information, when you allow individuals to say no, that you cannot have access to this kind of information, you reappropriate privacy, and we think that's important. Secondly, how you lose control. Because what they would peddle on that side is the illusion of consent and how consent would act as a bulwark for individuals' liberties. We don't think that really works. Firstly, and this is something that most people will be used to, that whenever you get the confidential agreement or the privacy agreement that you're supposed to mark yes or no with when you download certain apps, most people don't read these agreements. Like, they've been on a They've been trying to educate people and getting people to read it. Some companies have tried to shorten it, but in reality, most people don't. What they do is that they just press yes because they need to have access to the information. And what's more pernicious is this, the momentum of mobile apps. Because at a point where perhaps 10% of the population subscribe to a particular app, the momentum carries on from there, which means that individuals are fervently swept in that momentum. For example, the ascension of Facebook. When more and more colleges started subscribing to Facebook instead of Friendster, everybody else was swept. That's why between a period of 2 to 3 years, the number of people who subscribed to Facebook was immense. I signed up and I consented to it not because I agree with what was there, but because I thought that I couldn't do without Facebook because everybody else was doing with Facebook and I would lose out massively if I didn't subscribe to it. Which means that any act of consent on my part isn't an effective bulwark at all. Thirdly, in most cases, you have kids using credit card details or private details of parents, and they are able to store the information for the benefit of the individual. But kids don't know any better, and the use of the information is itself an intrusion. And lastly, we think laws are constantly outpaced. The problem is that legislative rules can't always regulate the situation about how the information is going to be used, because in most instances, legislative bodies don't know how tech companies work and how this information is going to be used. Every time they come out with laws, the way the information is constantly being used or reused by tech companies outpaces those laws. Now, governmental surveillance. The thing is, no matter how solid you think your contracts are, at the point where governments like the Chinese government stamp down upon you as a company, like for example Google, they usually crack and they give up the information. Like when China pressed and pressurized Google, they basically gave up all the information that they had, and there's currently some litigation going on about how they can reappropriate some of that information back. So why is that bad? Because once governments have access to that information, they basically pass through things, like for example, NSA operators who pass around your dick pics or any sex chats that you might have, and how that acts as a moral affront towards individuals and the way they want to define themselves. Now, what we do on our side is that when you prohibit it at any point, governments can't ostensibly then pressurize companies to try and have access to that information because that information isn't even available in the first place. So that acts as the most effective check because we can't expect governments on their own to try and regulate themselves. Because what we do is that we stem the information from its heart, and for these reasons I'm proud to propose.